story, the same story that this great historical text told. My friend found they were something different. He found they were from the reign of King Menepetar, the king of the Israel Stela. You'll see that it's the king attacking fortresses. There's the chariot, there's all the dead people underneath the chariot, and he's attacking a fortress. And even that mess underneath, that's another scene and another fortress. And here, the same king attacking another fortress. Ascalon it is, one of the towns named on the Israel Stela. And here is a guy chopping the doorway down, somebody lowering their dead child with one of Pharaoh's arrows stuck in it off the battlements, and all the people praying for the king to stop. So we have 3 towns, just the same as we do on the Israel Stela. Up there, being crushed by Pharaoh's chariots and the Egyptian cavalry, is a Bedouin tribe, which, if my friend is right, is the same Bedouin tribe mentioned on the Israel Stela. In fact, they're the oldest known pictures of the ancient Israelites. This is the ancient city of Megiddo, one of the first Canaanite cities, so the Bible tells us, that was captured by Joshua and the invading Israelites. Perhaps the same Israelites that are on that temple wall at Karnak. But you know, archaeologists working here haven't found a single trace of them. One thing you can be sure of, whether the Israelites were ever here or not, these Canaanite cities had a powerful influence on the people who wrote the Bible. And you can see them right through Israel, right through Syria too. They're usually set on trade routes, often amidst fields of corn, sometimes by the sea. But it's the land behind, filled by peasants, the land all around these towns, that kept the little courts who lived up here in a fair degree of luxury. There's a lovely, lively little drawing of one of these Canaanite courts, and it's cut onto a slip of ivory from the tusk of a Syrian elephant. And it shows the ruler proudly sitting on his recently imported Egyptian throne, all feathers and lovely leopard's legs and things. And in front of him is all his court sitting out one by one. There's a musician plonking away on his lyre. There's the inevitable spear carrier standing there. And behind him, the captain of the chariots. They love chariots. They used to go chariot racing. A lot of their wars were in chariots. Now, it's a lovely little drawing, but it's not great art. Canaanites never really made great art. But there's one way in which they influence us down till today, and that's through their literature and through their religion. And through those 2 things, they influence the Old Testament and Judaism, Christianity, and the Bible. At the centre of all ancient cities, of course, stood the gods. And these Canaanite cities were no exception. In fact, they were built around even more ancient, high places. That is, hills that from time immemorial have been regarded as sacred, certain spots on them as holy spots. And this is one of them. The most ancient sanctuary of Megiddo, the high place of Megiddo, the heart of Megiddo, or as the Bible calls it, Armageddon. In other words, this was the theatre, perhaps the stalls, from which you could watch the end of the world. Now, there was another one of these Canaanite high places at Jerusalem. And that was the seat of another god, Baal Zephon. And that becomes the Christians' Mount Zion. When the archaeologists were digging here, they found the top of the altar covered in burnt bones. Animals were sacrificed on this altar in great quantity and then burnt. The offering was called olah. It's where the Bible's word Holocaust comes from, a burnt offering. Now, this was put up probably about 3,000 years before Christ. Before long, Megiddo became quite a rich town, and they built this great temple behind the altar for more elaborate rituals for the gods. Consider for a moment what you've got here. You've got a place for burnt offerings. You've got the temple itself. Inside the temple would have been a place for washing, and you have its Holy of Holies. Now, these are exactly the same elements that you find in King Solomon's temple at Jerusalem, thousands of years later. That too had its burnt offering, it had its brazen bowl as big as the sea, and it had its Holy of Holies. King Solomon's name, incidentally, contains the name of a Canaanite god, the god Solom, the god of the evening star. Now, it might not look much at the moment, but it was home for a Canaanite god. Actually, in its day, it was a great black building with tiny little slits, and the shafts of light came down here on these two great columns. Certainly not as grand as ancient Egypt, is it? But when these temples were found, they had beautiful little incense altars along the front. And the nice thing about the Canaanites, they weren't great architects, but they did love their music. And on these incense tables, which still survive, you can find tiny little figures of musicians, and they're playing instruments, pipes, banging drums, all sorts of things. Canaanites adored music. This room must have really jumped when they got going for their god. In actual fact, you can still find something of this in the Bible. Look at the Psalms in an old Bible, and you'll find these strange words set between the verses, sometimes after the title of the psalm. They're old musical instructions. We don't know what they mean today. They've been left out of modern Bibles. But there's something to do with the wonderful music that was made in these places. It's all silent now. Actually, there are yet more connections with the Canaanites than that. Think of that great Psalm 137. Think of that verse, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand lose its cunning." Well, that's a very clever Old English adaptation of a very difficult Hebrew line that nobody really understood before. It should read, as we now know when we've got Canaanite originals to tell us, "May my right hand wither." Not quite as poetic, but probably more accurate. Now, I'm not saying that the Old Testament is all Canaanite literature. What I am saying is that traditions of Canaanite literature are very strong in the Old Testament. Just as the Bible says, ancient Canaan was destroyed. Archaeologists have found all these cities burnt and ruined, but they've also found that this wasn't done by the Israelites, but by a lot of other people, a great mass of tribes coming down from the north. And once again, at Thebes in Egypt, you can see pictures of them. Because after they destroyed Canaan, these same tribes went on to attack Egypt. And in the end, only the Egyptian armies were strong enough to stop them. After their defeat, one of these tribes went back to Canaan and settled down along the coast. The Egyptians had called them the Peliset. The Bible knows them as the Philistines, the mortal enemies of ancient Israel. About 100 years after the Egyptians had repulsed that terrible invasion, a priest set out from Thebes to go to Lebanon, sailing right up the Mediterranean coast to buy some cedar wood for his temple. In the course of his journey, he stopped here, on the coast at Dor. Now, by this time, the Canaanites were no more. This was not the land of Canaan. The coastal area was called Philistia, our Palestine, and the Philistines lived here. Those same people who had attacked Egypt had sort of broken back like a great wave and settled along the plain, built big, strong cities. They found that all this wonderful coastline was made of petrified sandbanks, and they were able to cut into it quite easily and make all sorts of harbours. Some of the oldest slipways in the world are still here. The Philistines had brought a completely new culture and completely new religion to this land. When they moved about, of course, they only had mobile things they could carry. Splendid swords, fine helmets, all the sort of paraphernalia of mobile peoples. When they settled down, they started to make all sorts of things. They made especially fine pottery. And this is a splendid example. You can see a lovely seated lady looking at her eyeball to eyeball. You can almost feel the Philistines in her. She's wearing too, or she would have been wearing, a beautiful gold necklace. Philistines were quite good metal workers too. So this is quite an elegant and refined thing. It's a funny thing to think, really. The Philistines weren't Philistine at all. It's just that they've been given a particularly lousy press. Well, of course, we know who gave them a lousy press, the Israelites in the Old Testament. And where were they at this time? Well, they weren't along the coast. Nobody found anything of them here. In fact, nobody's found hide or hair of them for miles round here. Neither along the coast, nor on the plain behind. If you take the Bible's word for it, however, you can assume that they were up there in the mountains, because that's where the Bible stories of early Israel are set. David, King David, was once a shepherd boy up in these hills, and when he fought Goliath the Philistine, he took the pebbles for his sling from the bed of a mountain stream. Most of the combats in the early history of Israel take place in just this area, in the zone between the green fields of the Philistines and the uplands of the Israelites. In David's stories, you can see it all very well laid out for you. Chalky mountains with caves where kings and things can hide in, traditional crops, olives, grapes. The Bible here has painted such an accurate description of exactly what was going on in Israel at that time of history. But what can archaeology tell us was happening up in the mountains at the same time? The poor people who'd moved into the mountains were obsessed with storing food. It was a very hard life. They were even obsessed with water too. These pits, in most of the big rooms of these houses, were used to store rainwater. When the archaeologists came to dig them out, they found they weren't just any old pit. To start with, they're absolutely enormous. Whoops, look at this. And it's really big. You could stand up in there, would hold enough water to see you through the summer. And these people weren't half daft either, because archaeologists soon realised that these cisterns were cut before the houses were made. In other words, the people turned up, thought, we're going to live here, God help them. They cut their cisterns, their elaborate cisterns, and then they put their little houses on top. They could read too. As the archaeologists were sieving through the dirt, they discovered tiny little fragments of Canaanite texts, so small that you couldn't even read them, but big enough to see that some of the people here at least were literate. And then, marvel upon marvels, in another site, they found a tiny little limestone tablet. Looks really miserable looking thing, actually. It's got scratches all over it. But those scratches turned out to be what is now called Paleo-Hebrew, because later on it was an alphabet that would develop into Hebrew. Incidentally, that too came from Canaan, the original form of the Hebrew language. So, to sum up, what exactly have you got here? You've got intelligent people living as settlers with an imported technology. Where do they come from, these people? Well, all the hard archaeological evidence suggests that they've been refugees from the old Canaanite cities, refugees from the invasions that were coming down the coast. From people, in fact, like the Philistines,